thanks to The Economist for having me. If we could get the slides up, I will canter through this because I am obviously conscious that we're running behind. Next slide, please. Obviously, I'm not going to run through my CV. All I'm pointing out here is that I've been involved in sports integrity for most of my professional career, but certainly since 2010, the cricket scandals, where I was centrally involved in the various things that happened across the world. But I'm talking about technology here and the integration and help that it's provided, and that's really been and very much what the last talk was about, was integrated into my work since 2015, since I moved into esports. Extremely important part of the fight, but it brings many other advantages, and that's really what I wanted to concentrate on in the short time we have today. So if we look at the next slide, I wanted to do a little overview of the esports ecosystem, because I find that in the general traditional sports world, whether that's governance, regulation, integrity, all those areas, esports is very, very poorly understood. Historically, of course, it wasn't even known about, never mind understood. But, and that understanding has improved and the visibility has improved. But for many people, they think esports is an extension of traditional sports, and if they think about the competitive video gaming scene, they immediately jump to two conclusions. Firstly, they think of sports simulator games like FIFA, Pro Evo, Formula One, Madden, NBA 2K, where in fact in the esports world, those sports simulator games barely move the needle. I'm not saying they're unimportant, but in the grand scheme of things, particularly with respect to competitive integrity, they are very, very minor part of the esports ecosystem. The bulk of it is made up of traditional video games, first-person shooters, multiplayer online battle arena games, many of whom, the names of which will not be familiar to people outside of the esports world. So games like Counter-Strike, games like League of Legends, Defense of the Ancients 2, these are mega games. They are huge. And the second thing that people need to understand and accept is that esports players are not some fat kid in his mom's basement who's quite good at video games. They are at the top level in tier 1 games like Counter-Strike, League of Legends, Dota 2, Valorant, these sort of games. The top-end players in the top-tier teams are as good at what they do as Ronaldo is good at football or Messi is good at football. If you don't accept that, you're missing the point. These players have Malcolm Gladwell the hell out of these things. They have put their 10,000 hours in. They are the masters of what they do, and the professional structure around them is huge and rich, it very much resembles in most cases what you expect from traditional sports team organizations and structures. The problem with esports, in a sense, is that it's an umbrella term that it's a little bit like saying to that there's the Olympics. The Olympics covers multiple sports that each have their own culture, their own, obviously their own rules, their own meta structure, and esports is very, very similar in that regard. It's better to think of it as individual game verticals, because every game has its own community, its own culture, its own structure, and most importantly, every game is owned by a publisher. So just as in traditional sport, FIFA doesn't own football and the ICC does not own cricket, in esports the games are owned by developers who can change those games, who can determine who plays them, who doesn't, under what conditions, and can stop somebody playing their game if they breach certain license conditions. And even if they don't, these businesses who are for profit can choose with whom they do business. And that gives the publishers, the developers, huge power in our ecosystem. And that is extremely important, because what has not happened is the emergence of any governing body or central authority within esports. That's still very much siloed on a game-by-game basis. So if we go to the next slide, And this is, again, to show you that that there are multiple games. This is very much out of date, but the top tier remains valid. And these games are each owned by publishers who determine whether they run an esports league on the back of those games, or whether they outsource the running of an esports competition, league, tournament to a tournament organizer, big companies like ESL and others that put on these mega events. And in fact, in Katowice in Poland right now, as of today, there'll probably be 40-odd thousand people sitting in the Spodek Arena watching Counter-Strike as day one of the public part of the Intel Extreme Masters begins today. And there will be millions of people watching online. So we go to the next slide. This is what I see as the pros, because, sorry about the slide messing up there, inclusio. These are what I see as the pros of, with respect to social inclusion that are fostered by esports in particular. So firstly, as a sport or as an activity, it's free and relatively cheap, and it's not weather or venue dependent. So that gives it a massive advantage in terms of inclusivity away from any traditional sport. Then we have it as it's a global activity with no inherent gender, racial, sexual orientation or nationality differences. And that's in theory. There's also cons on that side, but you can see that in theory at least, everybody has the same ability outside of certain disabilities to engage in esports, right? It's data driven. And so things like anti-cheat and in what was just said around broadcast, how it helps with VAR, with multiple angles, microphones, and all of these things. Every adjudication within traditional sports still relies on a subjective judgment by a human. We have an advantage in esports in that everything is about data. Everything can be answered, or at least most things can be answered by an examination of the data, because it is a digital activity. And the in-game communication, playing in teams or talking to people in the big online games fosters, and that includes translation, and it fosters inclusion in theory. So if we go to the next slide, I will talk about the cons of exactly the same thing. The first I've already mentioned. There's no coherent structure for governance or regulation. It's literally on a case-by-case basis, and some of it is really, really terrible. There is the age-old problem with respect to gaming, but this has seeped into esports as well, as toxicity in the chat, misogyny, racism, homophobia. These are primarily young men with their hands and disposable income and conditioning from the red pill misogynistic brigade. So some of the things that are said in the chat, in the community, are very off-putting to certain elements of the community, in particular women and minorities. So social inclusion is fostered by, but also there are barriers to it within the esports and gaming world. There's a very poorly understood relationship between betting and traditional sport and in esports. So there's a lot of work to be done in education, because again, the lack of a governance structure and a regulatory structure means reaching the participants with a coherent message about match fixing, about cheating, about integrity is actually not particularly easy. But again, the technology does allow us to reach them. We just need to find the way to these individual communities. It's a very hard sport to commercialize. And that makes the betting sponsors and the betting companies and the data companies a very key element of that. And as you've pointed out, John, that brings, good and bad. It is a Faustian pact. It's your ultimate curate's egg. And we are, as the Esports Integrity Commission, smack in the middle of that. So there's very little understanding of it. If we jump, I think I'm finished. Let's just jump to the next slide. There might have been one more thing. Yeah. So I realize I've rattled on there, but basically the technology is both helpful and unhelpful, and esports and gaming can be used to promote social inclusion, but there needs to be a coherent center for that, and currently that doesn't really exist.